I think providing a forum through which students can get a deeper understanding of how others have tried to do some of these things, I think can be a really rich way to share experiences.
Let's discover what people are building in the greater Cleveland community. We are telling the stories of Northeast Ohio's entrepreneurs, builders, and those supporting them. Welcome to the Lay of the Land podcast, where we are exploring what people are building in Cleveland and throughout Northeast Ohio. I am your host, Jeffrey Stern, and today I had the real pleasure of speaking with Michael Goldberg, the Executive Director of the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship, as well as an Associate Professor of Design and Innovation at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University, where he teaches courses on entrepreneurship. Notably, Michael created a massive open online course, also known as a MOOC, for Case Western Reserve University called Beyond Silicon Valley, Growing Entrepreneurship in Transitioning Economies, a course which has attracted over 175,000 students from over 190 countries across the world. Before joining Case Western, Michael was the co-founder of the Bridge Investment Fund, a venture capital fund focused on investing in Israeli medical device companies that have synergies with the leading healthcare industries and institutions here in Cleveland. In addition, Michael served as the Director of International Business Development for AOL, responsible for structuring and negotiating international partnerships in Asia for America Online. In our conversation today, Michael covers his experience teaching entrepreneurship, and we focus on Case Western Reserve University's recently founded Alumni Venture Fund. The emergence of alumni venture funds has been one of the more exciting university trends that boosts awareness, support, and general discussions about entrepreneurship writ large within a community. And for any startup community to grow and strengthen its position, it must be able to leverage the local university. And so it was very informative to learn more about how Michael has thought about it here. If you think about the fact that at this point, just through Lay of the Land, we have featured over 20 Case Western alums on the show, from Charu Ramanathan of Cardio Insight and Vital Exchange, to Afif Ghanum of Biome Health, to Stan Garber and Alex Yakubovich of Scout RFP, which sold to Workday for $540 million. Then I think you can understand the power of such alumni funds and why this is exciting in the context of educating students about how venture capital works, in addition to actually supporting founders throughout Northeast Ohio. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Michael Goldberg after a brief word from our sponsor. Lay of the Land is brought to you by Impact Architects and by 90. As we share the stories of entrepreneurs building incredible organizations in Cleveland and throughout Northeast Ohio, Impact Architects has helped hundreds of those leaders, many of whom we have heard from as guests on this very podcast, realize their own visions and build these great organizations. I believe in Impact Architects and the people behind it so much that I have actually joined them personally in their mission to help leaders gain focus, align together, and thrive by doing what they love. If you too are trying to build great, Impact Architects is offering to sit down with you for a free consultation or provide a free trial through 90, the software platform that helps teams build great companies. If you're interested in learning more about partnering with Impact Architects or by leveraging 90 to power your own business, please go to ia.layoftheland.fm. The link will also be in our show notes. In preparing for our conversation today, I had taken stock of all the Case Western Reserve University affiliated entrepreneurs who have been on the podcast and realized that we've done, well over a dozen Lay of the Land episodes dedicated solely to those stories. And I think it speaks to the power of educational institutions in a local entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think it's a fun angle to begin the conversation today, because it pretty intuitively sets the stage, I think, to let us explore a lot of what we'll talk about, but from venture capital to startups, talent, academia, all together, I think, as we discuss more explicitly the recent formation of the Alumni Fund and the role that it can play in this space. But for one, thank you for coming on. Very excited, long time in the making.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeffrey, for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm a listener to the podcast, so I'm honored to be part of the Case Western Reserve University growing club of entrepreneurs and supporters of entrepreneurship to be guests.
So, with your own familiarity with the show, I think it always is helpful to set the stage with a little context on who you are as a person as we make our way towards the bulk of what we'll talk about today. But perhaps you can just share a little bit about your own journey and story and how you got to where you are today.
Sure, happy to. I'm a native Clevelander, grew up on the east side of Cleveland, and been sort of interested in entrepreneurship. Sort of broadly speaking, I mean, in those days, there wasn't a lot of necessarily high school entrepreneurship, even collegiate entrepreneurship. There were kind of pockets of it. Certainly now we're really blessed in Cleveland and other communities where that entrepreneurial itch is able to get scratched even by middle schoolers or high school students. But so I was kind of interested, but then I went off. I did my undergrad at Princeton where I studied public and international affairs, and then lived overseas for several years, running projects in South Africa. Initially, I was teaching in a rural Black school, and then I was working on a voter education program funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development for South Africa's first democratic elections when Mandela was elected in 1994. So really interesting sort of seeing the world. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do when I got home. I stayed there for 3 years and ended up applying to joint MBA and international affairs programs from South Africa and landed at Wharton, where I did my MBA, and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I did my master's in international affairs as a 3-year program. It was well timed for me in that it was sort of the beginning of the sort of internet 1.0. I did a summer internship out at Microsoft working on the pre-Xbox, something called the Internet Gaming Zone, and then got a job right after I graduated from the joint program at America Online, AOL, back in the
I've heard of it.
internet days. It's funny when I ask students now if they've heard of it. Many of them have not, but we were once the largest, certainly, internet company in the world, and merged with Time Warner when I was there. And I worked in a group that focused on international business development, which was super interesting, and kind of was there when it went up and was there when it came crashing down. And in 2023, we were seeing these elements again. So, I've lived long enough that I've seen a couple of these cycles, and my first kind of job out of grad school was part of it. Stayed at AOL for 5 years, worked on joint venture formation in Asia, then ended up through a family connection, connecting with an entrepreneur and investor who was based in Israel. And we set up a small venture capital fund to invest in early stage medical device companies that were coming out of Israel, sort of pre-US commercialization, and a lot of synergies with the healthcare institutions here. And that's what brought me back to Cleveland. At that point, I had 2 little kids. We added a third. And so I moved back home, brought my talents back to Cleveland. And then my association with Case Western Reserve University started off kind of innocently enough as an adjunct professor, just teaching one course. They were looking for somebody to teach the class on venture capital. It's called Entrepreneurial Finance. And then I started adding another course in here, and ultimately ended up taking a full-time position in the business school as a non-tenure track professor. So many business schools hire folks that don't have PhDs, but have experience working in the private sector. So did that. And then more recently added to my portfolio at the university, running our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship. And that sits on the 7th floor of ThinkBox and reports in essentially to the provost's office. And the provost is the sort of top academic officer at a university. So in that role, I work kind of around our whole campus around entrepreneurship. I maintain my faculty appointment. So really love being on a university campus and working with students and alums. And that's a little bit of my narrative.
So having had real, I think, experience with all parts of the entrepreneurial whole, venture capital, operating, startup environment, academia, talent, did you envision that, this is where in that whole you would be? And I guess in reflection, what kind of drew you to this space of education and academia?
I've got my 25th Wharton reunion coming up in about a month, and my friends I barely said a word in business school. So it's quite humorous to them that I'm actually a business school professor. I was coming out of the nonprofit sector into business school, but actually found Wharton a really wonderful place to kind of explore and test myself. And actually I found, even though I had a nonprofit background, a lot of the things that I had done in the nonprofit world in terms of setting up programs and distribution networks and marketing have application in the private sector. I've really enjoyed my association with Case Western Reserve University. I'm not an alum, but as a Clevelander, and you made reference, Jeffrey, at the beginning of the podcast to the important role that academic institutions or sort of anchor institutions play in a community. It was clear to me that this, and it's no secret. We're the largest research university in Northeast Ohio. They're called R1, sort of tier 1 research universities. There's 3 in the state of Ohio. So we're a really important player in research. We're a really important player in turning out talent. We have an awesome alumni base. So I've loved this as a perch to kind of roll my sleeves up and see what small contribution I can make in supporting entrepreneurship in our region, kind of through a role at the university.
So if you indulge a little detour here into a part of your experience that I want to talk a little bit about before we make our way back to the Alumni Fund, surrounding the kind of MOOC creation and all the work that went into that, and particularly through the lens of the Cleveland case study. You had talked about it in your TED Talk, which I believe was titled something like Beyond Silicon Valley, right? And from the late 1800s to the mid 1970s, Cleveland was a top 10 city in the country with regard to population, and historically industrious and entrepreneurial powerhouse, home to the greats, business titans, as they say, like Rockefeller. And something I learned from your TED Talk that I didn't even realize at the time was that I believe in 2001, Entrepreneur Magazine had done this ranking of cities in terms of entrepreneurship, and Cleveland had actually come in dead last. And now obviously a lot can change in the 20 plus years since. And I believe a lot has, with people who have come on this podcast alone to share their stories as a testament to some of the positive change. But I do think it's important to ground yourself in the reality of things as they are and were, however, they may be, so that you can have an understanding of the real options you have going forward. And otherwise you're somewhat deluding yourself to what those options might be. So I'm curious, this amount of time later, what is your assessment of where we are? What are the challenges we face, our trajectory? How has it changed?
No, thanks. And just for a little context on the MOOC, and there may be listeners that have never heard that term, which was true for me when my dean asked me if I would consider doing one. So MOOC stands for Massive Open Online Course. Coursera is one of the largest platforms for MOOCs, and the university, Case Western Reserve, had partnered with Coursera to kind of begin to explore offering these online courses to a broader community outside of the folks that we educate. We're a private university here. We have about 6,000 undergrads, a little bit more, 6,000 grad students. So you're reaching 12,000 students at a time, but these MOOCs can reach a heck of a lot more people. So the idea for the MOOC grew out of actually the first Fulbright that I got, which I applied for on a complete whim, and moved my family to Hanoi, Vietnam. And I was asked by a government agency, within the Ministry of Science and Technology, they had a national agency for technology, entrepreneurship, and commercialization, if I could do a seminar for them about how Vietnam could become more like Silicon Valley or become Silicon Valley. And at that point, I had sort of been there for a couple months and said, you guys look more like Cleveland than you do Silicon Valley. And, of course, they were like, what's Cleveland? Wasn't necessarily a city that is often, comes up when you think about models for entrepreneurship. But what I shared with them in the seminar, and I ended up including, and I was using Skype back then for another throwback. You get AOL and Skype in the same podcast. So there's a 12-hour time difference. So kind of evening in Hanoi and morning here, I was joined by Lisa Delp, who used to be the executive director of the Ohio Third Frontier, which, as many of your listeners probably know, if you're Cleveland based, is our state program, $2.3 billion program that supports tech commercialization and entrepreneurship. Lena Grease, who's a good friend who at the time was at Jumpstart, joined via Skype. Steve Gerard, who's the Case Western Reserve University alum, who at the time was at Johnson & Johnson. So we talked about different things that Cleveland was doing. And then when I came back to Cleveland, I'd had a conversation with Deb Hoover from the Burton D. Morgan Foundation about potentially turning this case study into a MOOC, and they were nice enough to provide some funding. And I worked with a friend of mine that was a former 60 Minutes producer to help tell the story, and another great local team, Northwater Partners. And, we put this Cleveland case study, as you mentioned, up there, not really being sure if anybody would be interested in it. This is relatively early in the MOOC sort of arc. And so it went up in 2014, and like many courses that are on Coursera's platform, or at least some of them, we found that there was an interesting appetite from particularly international audiences. So we ended up, the MOOC is now translated in 16 different languages with subtitles in those languages, ranging from Khmer to Farsi to Chinese to Spanish to Kinyarwandan. I mean, it just was so interesting to see that there was an appetite. I think the Silicon Valley story and all the excitement and famous companies and iconic names, like everybody enjoys watching, TV shows and things about all these people. But it turns out, I think the Cleveland experience, and, Jeffrey, I know you've been here for a few years coming from New York, this is a more challenging environment to support entrepreneurship, and we're using government money, and we're using philanthropy, and we're using private money. So I've enjoyed, and I've gotten to do a ton of travel even since that Vietnam experience. I mean, I've probably done 30 different workshops around the world. The U.S. State Department's been a really great partner. I've done some work with Microsoft, and, sort of proudly taking our Cleveland experience. And, it's not a perfect experience, as you know well. There's some things I think that we've done here that we can be quite proud of. We've experimented. I just had in class last week Brian Verne, who in 2016 ended up not getting funding from Jumpstart and a few local folks, and then went out to California and was in 500 startups. And Ray Leach from Jumpstart wrote a piece and said, hey, it's okay. Not every company is going to sort of stay in Cleveland. And then Brian, like a week later, wrote back. He was like, actually, it's a big problem that, Cleveland wasn't able to keep me. So he was in class. It's just interesting. I mean, now Brian's first company failed. His second one has raised a good amount of venture capital. So, I think we're a work in progress. I think our progress will be measured over decades with all the different entrepreneurs and folks in the ecosystem that you've had on. I mean, there's a bunch of people in Cleveland who kind of wake up every day thinking about opportunities to strengthen the support for startups here. And some of it's worked and some of it hasn't worked so well.
From the MOOC standpoint and just, pulling in your experience in, the actual education piece, it's something I've thought actually a lot about, but how do you teach entrepreneurship? Like, can you actually teach entrepreneurship?
The age-old question, are entrepreneurs made or born? I think in some ways, like my approach with my MOOC, in some ways, like mirrors my classroom work here. Whether it's a Brian Verne or other speakers, David Boone, we've had in class this year. I mean, I love, much like you're doing with your podcast, I mean, sort of creating a forum for folks that are experiencing capital raising, experiencing trying to build a business, experiencing the challenge of product market fit. I mean, there are a whole host of challenges that make the decision that one takes to sort of take an entrepreneurial journey I mean, folks know it's going to be hard. And I think, and it's hard anywhere, right? It doesn't matter if you're in San Francisco, Austin, Tel Aviv, Cleveland, Hanoi. But I do think that, and I'm hopeful. I mean, I'm not saying that I've done anything so perfectly, or even my colleagues that teach entrepreneurship wherever we do it, because there's plenty of entrepreneurs that like didn't graduate from college, let alone take entrepreneurship classes, let alone get an MBA. So I think providing a forum through which students can get a deeper understanding of how others have tried to do some of these things, I think can be a really rich way to share experiences. It doesn't mean that I'm churning out. I mean, frankly, even at a place like Case Western Reserve University, where we have, I think, a number of students that are incredibly accomplished and want to go on to do startups, and some do. I mean, if we can just give people a taste of it, and then maybe they go get a job at an Eaton or a Key or IBM, wherever, and maybe they come back to this later. So when we measure our quote unquote success at a university and in the entrepreneurship space, maybe I'm just being a little self-interested because we don't create tons. We actually have our signature Morgan Thaler Pavey startup competition is coming up, and we have a great pipe. We have like a record number of people that are pitching, and we have new tracks and all these things. But it may very well be that student that was an engineer and took an entrepreneurship class and goes and does something more traditional, and then they come back to this later. So and tracking them and keeping in touch, even with tools like LinkedIn, which do help a little bit, is something that someone did during their time here that planted that little bit of a kernel of an idea. Maybe they come back to it in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, folks coming through Case Western are building things, and right, we've been able to document some of those here. But yeah, I always come back to it because, from my own perspective, having come to Cleveland originally through Venture for America, which I think shares this ethos of trying to teach entrepreneurship. There's always this tension to me between learning and practice and learning and theory. And I don't know, where I've kind of come to on it is that there's one of these mental models, which is kind of trite, but it's the map is never the territory, because the best maps are imperfect, and they are necessarily reductions of what they're trying to represent. And so
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's interesting, just in the podcasting world in which you've planted yourself in. I mean, there's the podcast startup, which is a company called Gimlet Media, which was acquired by Spotify. Like, there's an episode called in season 1 of Startup called "How to Divide an Imaginary Pie," and it is just such a brilliantly produced episode. I don't know. Have you listened to that startup, Jeffrey?
No, I haven't.
That podcast. So in this episode, and it's produced. I mean, the founder of Gimlet is a guy named Alex Bloomberg, who was on This American Life. I mean, he was a great public media producer. But on this episode, it was a founder negotiating with someone that would be a joining as a co-founder in the startup, and they sent the recording equipment. So they recorded their negotiation as they were negotiating equity, which is always a very, can be a very contentious, difficult discussion, right? I mean, I think the guy who was coming in initially wanted 50-50, right? And Alex Bloomberg wanted to do 90-10. But the brilliant thing they did in the podcast was they sent the recording equipment home for each of the two, and then they ended up being co-founders to have a discussion with their wives about the negotiation. And, it all came back together later. I mean, obviously they didn't play it while they were negotiating. And then, they ended up at sort of 60-40, but it was just that, when I was, and I'm assuming even Jeffrey, you're younger than me, when you were in school, like you didn't have professors assigning podcasts. I assigned that podcast in class, and I've had actually Matt Lieber, who's the co-founder, not in the past couple of years, come in as a surprise guest, because we'll listen to it and we have different pieces of tape. So, whether it's a book, the book Venture Deals, which was written by Brad Feld and Jason Mendelsohn, which is a really great kind of glossary book of deals. So in this sort of quote unquote teaching of entrepreneurship, like, we have some great tools out there. I mean, no offense to like textbook, makers because they
Yeah.
still are out there in the world. But like, my whole syllabus is just a bunch of like podcasts, and I do use venture deals and articles, and and then like when SVB goes down, it's like then we're talking about it in class. It's like what can we sort of pull from the headlines? A lot of times I'll do that. So I'll literally call it like pulled from the headlines and try to pull stuff because
Yeah.
I think that's a rich opportunity.
I agree with you there. It's a much higher fidelity of material that you can work with today. It's not so much of a reduction. And I think it's actually a great segue to talk about the Alumni Venture Fund, because I think in practice, as I understand it, what it is more of an apprenticeship where it's teaching and doing at the same time, which maybe is the best hybrid.
Yep. So we're lucky actually in Northeast Ohio. There's an organization called the Northeast Ohio Student Venture Fund, which was started probably about 10 years ago, funded with support from the Burton D. Morgan Foundation initially. And there's several university chapters. We have one at Case Western Reserve, at Worcester, Akron, Kent, Cleveland State, a few other sort of in the region. And that was set up actually as a way for students to come together and do due diligence, which is the sort of process by which, investors are sort of engaging with potential companies to invest in. And they're making decisions about deploying capital into companies. We also have sent from our university students to participate in something called the Venture Capital Investment Competition, which is run out of University of North Carolina, which is another awesome way for students to kind of get, that's a simulation, but to kind of get experience in venture. When I first came to teach at Case Western Reserve University, I mentioned this first class was obviously a venture capital class. So there's like a tremendous amount of interest in how investors think about investing in companies. And over the past few years, there's been a growth in broadly speaking, alumni funds. And there's a couple different ways that these funds have been set up. So the Alumni Ventures Group, shortened to AVG, operates 21 of these funds. They started, was a Dartmouth alum. Those are for-profit private funds that sit outside a university that are investing in, let's say Dartmouth. Now they have 21 is Dartmouth, Princeton, Cornell, Northwestern, alums of those universities, students, spin-outs. And they also actually kind of count if you would be, if there's an alumni investor in the deal. So those sit outside the university are sort of for-profit, and they sort of pull on the heartstrings or loyalties that alums of those universities have. Their pitch is basically, hey, don't you love MIT or Princeton or Dartmouth? Wouldn't you want to invest and sort of support? Now, interestingly, they're doing it out of their investment pocket, not their donor pocket. Another model, which is actually the path that we took, there's something called the Wolverine Fund out of the University of Michigan, which is donations to the university, then with faculty, in the case of University of Michigan, and now kind of with Case, sort of involved in helping overseeing. But really, the due diligence process, like Northeast Ohio's Student Venture Fund, kind of led by students. And so that's the path we took. The Veale Foundation, which is the endowed our institute that I run, the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship. I had talked to them about the fact that we at the university didn't have this kind of a vehicle, and I know it's a topic that's come up, and with entrepreneurs that you've talked to, kind of access to capital. And it's kind of interesting that what getting access to a deal, oftentimes, because you're in these situations, whether it's Alumni Venture Group or us, you're joining in syndicates, so you're not leading a deal. So there's got to be a lead that's sort of formed. You're just joining. Some of the deals that because we have put $200,000 to work already, just in kind of what we were calling a demonstration period last year to sort of see if we could get into deals. We actually decided to not look at deals in which the alums were an investor. We're like, all right, let's just stick to alumni founders, spin-outs, or students and see if we can get into deals. Some of the deals were like oversubscribed. There was sort of no room. And because of the relationship that because we sit at the university they made room for us. Some were smaller rounds. Many of these funds, including ours, are stage agnostic. So you could do a later stage deal. The deal flow tends to be earlier stage, sort of seed, Series A. And yeah, it's been really interesting. So I think we sort of proved out, at least over last year, that we could get access to interesting deal flow. We did 6 deals. 2 of the 6 were here in Northeast Ohio. 4 were outside the region. 1 was a spin out. And, we're actively deploying capital in new companies now. We're doing some fundraising against the initial commitment from the Veale Foundation. So it's been a lot of fun. I mean, I think you said it right at the beginning. I mean, it's an awesome teaching vehicle. I have a really great group of students that are cross-disciplinary, very diverse. So I have some medical students. I have 2 MD PhDs. I've got Weatherhead School of Management students. I have engineering students. I have a law student. I'm recruiting this week a nursing student. We've got 8 schools at the university, and my goal is to actually mine talent from all of them. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it and seeing the students, because they're making real investments, like getting their due diligence jobs and interacting. I think in a way that's a real pleasure to see, interacting with startup founders in a way that I think makes me proud and makes the university proud, because they're asking great questions and building networks. So it's been a lot of fun.
No, it seems like really incredible progress, very exciting prospects for it. When you think about the fund overall, I guess what is the broader vision you have for it? Is it as a teaching vehicle? Is it, in the context of this evergreen and philanthropically funded model, something else? What is the overall, objective here?
Well, the evergreen term, which means basically you're with success from these investments, you're sort of pooling that money back into the pot, has been done very well by our friends at Jumpstart. So, and with Cover My Meds being the best example of that. I mean, Jumpstart's made a number of bets and had some success, and the biggest being Cover My Meds. So like Jumpstart, a part of what we're doing, I mean, I'd say teaching and learning is sort of at the top of the funnel and sort of why we're doing this, but picking companies that we believe can be successful is the goal. I mean, that's the teaching goal. We're sort of asking our students to make bets on companies that we think will have financial success. And if they do have financial success over time, that money will then go back into the fund to fund new deals. So, I think, University of Michigan's Wolverine Fund started with $2 million, is up to $7 million. My hope would be is that the legacy of the fund, which includes student learning, which includes really interesting alumni engagement. Like, it's been a great way. One of the companies that we invested in was our first investment. Like, the alum really hadn't been engaged in the university at all. And subsequently, he's come back to speak to students on campus. He met with us when we were out in San Francisco. So it's a very cool way to engage with alums. Another initial outcome, which has been cool, which is very hard to do, is that one of our students already got a job in venture capital. So seeing our fellows, we call them, the students that work on this, go and work in the venture space may not happen like it did for Amar Kazi right out of school, but we're super proud of that. So, it's not the return on investment traditional metrics. If we were a private fund, that's part of the equation, but we got some other things that we're looking to do as well. But it does include ROI.
To piggyback on the conversation we were having earlier about, can you teach entrepreneurship? I think on the flip side of the coin, can you teach venture capital? This seems like the right way to do it. I'm curious, what do you find are the maybe biggest misconceptions people have coming into this, that, because I feel like we're very deep in this space. And so I'm always kind of interested to understand, even when I use the term Series A casually in conversation, right? Like, it's not a term that broadly resonates. And so as you bring in a real kind of eclectic, broad group of students into this world, what are the things that we can be doing better to just kind of quell misconceptions people have about venture capital?
Well, one, in terms of accessing deals, I think there's folks that aren't close to this world just sort of assume, oh, okay, well, venture capital is just to go pick the best companies and invest in them. That presumes that you have access. Tim Milanich, who is our chief investment officer at the university and is as a partner of mine in helping with this alumni fund, talks about venture capital as an access class, not an asset class. And, interestingly, probably our most, I don't know, we have lots of famous alums, including like maybe our most famous entrepreneurial alum is like Dow from Dow Chemical graduated from Case Institute of Technology, and I don't know, 100 years ago. But in more recent memory, there's 4 alums: Stan Garber, Alex Yakubovich, Chris Crane, and Andrew Durlike founded a company called Scout RFP out on the West Coast. It was sold to Workday for over $600 million. So Stan and Alex, and I know them both. I didn't have them in class, but they have a new company that they started about a year ago. I was like, hey, can you make room for us in the deal? And, part of our hypothesis was we could get into these deals. We know them. They're sort of proud to let me in Scout for alums. And, basically like in this case, like Benchmark, this is one of the leading funds, like took the whole round, like there wasn't room. And I was begging you. I was like, and it's been interesting because we mostly got access to deals. That one we were not. We're hoping maybe Stan and Alex, if you're listening, for the next round, you'll let us in. But I think one of the most common, it's not a misconception. I just think people don't understand it. Like, it's not quite as easy as just being like, oh, we'd love to be in Stan and Alex's new company. Like, so would everybody. So, how do you use your networks and relationships? I mean, John Cobbs, who is an alum, who was a founder of a company called Apartment List, started a company called Wild XYZ, digital art, NFTs, oversubscribed round, led by Matrix Ventures with Reid Hoffman and Gwyneth Paltrow. And all, he made room for us. It was, in a very, didn't need our money, but made room. So, we're hoping that, and I think that's been an interesting teaching moment for the students, because they sort of see, the other thing we talk about when you're a joining fund is like being fast and frictionless in the diligence process. And we sort of joke internally, like we say that we're fast and frictionless and we're neither, right? Because we're learning, right? So we're trying to, because we want our students to make informed decisions about due diligence. So that involves having to have a conversation. The CEOs are busy. We'd like to talk to co-investors, but if we're investing a small amount of money, so that's another piece of the puzzle. Like, you don't have unlimited time to make a decision on the investment. You have, and particularly when you're doing a very small check size and like you're not leading the round, no one is waiting for us to do this. So that's been another, I think, really important teaching moment for the students. Like, we've got to go fast or we're going to miss these. If we can even get access, we better do this fast or we're going to miss that opportunity. So that's been another really important teaching opportunity as we churn out all these venture capitalists among our fellows.
Right. No, I think that's an important point, particularly as I think we often talk about it from the perspective of founders raising capital, how difficult that can be, but that there is this competition amongst investors on the other side of it, trying to get access to these deals. And it comes down to those things like, what is, your respect for founders' time, and what is the overall process that you are enabling for founders going through it. And those things, typically, they make their way back to other founders who later are going through the diligence process. And that's how firms get reputations.
And even on that point, working with the students, if you're going to make an informed decision, sharing that the reason is no and why we said no, that's a hard conversation, right? And that's a huge learning opportunity. And, as much as entrepreneurs have thick skin because they're getting turned down a lot, like they don't love hearing. And, we're part of the university, so that there's some interesting dynamics. And the students, I've loved watching them learn. I'm learning a lot, and I have some experience in venture capital. It is delicate, and we can't. We're going to say no to more deals than we say yes to, but doing it in a way, as you say, that sort of helps build the reputation of the fund, gets our students a great learning experience. But it's definitely we're learning along the way, and I think because we have some great students, and I think part of it is getting because we have founders that are out there. I mean, many of these founders are sort of, let's say, they're in the university family, they're alums, or they're spin-outs of some students. I think they see the value of what we're trying to do, but telling them no still isn't a lot of fun. So making sure that we do that in a way that is respectful and communicative, even if they don't want to hear it.
What are some of the other reflections and learnings that you've had as part of this process? And I can throw out a few topics that I'd be interested to get your perspective on, because I know they're things I think about a lot. One of them always being the challenge of more on the talent side of it, from retention, and how we can amplify the efficacy of our own ecosystem here through that. Is there an avenue through which this can help on the retention side? How does it work from a continuity perspective? As folks graduate, literally, and new folks have to come into the fund, the onboarding mechanism for getting people up to speed, maybe just the role within the greater Cleveland ecosystem. Just a few prompts there.
Sure. No, I mean, I, like you, and I've been here a bit longer, I want to see the ecosystem thrive. I believe that the university has a really important role to play in that. There are other ecosystems, like our friends to the east in Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon and Pitt, and their role in the ecosystem, and I think we do a good job. I mean, we can always get better, but folks will point to some of Pittsburgh's success due to the role that Pitt and CMU have played. So I think, I'm thrilled that the community looks to Case Western Reserve as a critical player here. We have talent. We as we've become much more of a national and an international university. I mean, just in terms of student flow, I don't exactly know what the numbers are, but let's say 20 or 30 years ago, we were, predominantly an Ohio university in terms of where our talent was coming from. And now, our student talent's coming from everywhere. I mean, anybody that is listening that is a parent with kids applying to college, they know kind of how crazy down the application process, which is, I think, worked well for us. I mean, I don't know for you, Jeffrey, but I've got a lot of friends on the East Coast. I live on the East Coast. All of a sudden, I'm getting all these visits from New York and DC and Boston. I mean, we are on the radar, which is awesome, which means that, it's harder to get in here. The talent is better. But this question, as you reference, of retaining that talent when somebody comes from New York or Boston or San Francisco, and those are pretty vibrant ecosystems. So, some of those folks are going to go back home to where they're from. I do think that the Alumni Fund can play a role in a very small way, with just a little bit of capital, and helping show entrepreneurs that there's capital. I mean, not surprisingly, we're looking at co-investing with Jumpstart, with University Hospital Ventures, and other local investors with North Coast Ventures. So, I think we punch under our weight in terms of availability of venture capital and angel investing in the region. I think most people would agree with that. I mean, we actually have probably punch over our weight in terms of private equity and the private equity funds that are here. So, even these small efforts, and this is, what we're doing on campus, is a relatively small effort. We do have some other funds on campus. There's something called the Spartan Fund, which is run out of our technology transfer office. Now, they're exclusively focused on spin outs of our university. But, I think every little thing helps. And if we can call more attention, another one of our goals with the fund is to some degree, and this takes a page from kind of the angel fund approach, in which you could have sidecar investments into, so we may have a donor. Then this has not played out yet, but I'm hopeful. Let's say somebody donates to our fund through their involvement with us. They find out about a spin out or a startup, perhaps one here in Northeast Ohio, and all of a sudden they're putting money out of their investment pockets that they've donated out of their donor pocket to the fund, but then they're putting another check to work out of their investment pocket. So I think that, while it hasn't happened yet because our fund is so new, I'm hopeful that may be another way to bring more capital to work to support local startups.
Well, yeah, it's all very exciting, and hope to see you guys get involved in as many deals as possible going forward. I want to leave a little space here because I think just the breadth of things that you're involved with through case, outside of case, just ancillary to any of those that you want to talk about here and unpack that you think are important that we haven't really touched on yet.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's the little things like we have our upcoming Morgan Taylor Pavey startup competition, and we're feeding our guests with a student startup called Red Heart and an entrepreneur that we met through the Cleveland Central Kitchen, which is a really great food hub down on Carnegie. We've done a couple of different projects with them. So David Ball, who's an entrepreneur who makes barbecue sauce and emerging. So I think one of the things that we, as we start to gather more together, thinking about those community entrepreneurs that are outside of sort of our tech-based high growth startups, like there's just a lot of cool local entrepreneurs, and we got to eat and we got to drink. So I think being thoughtful about where we can and connecting our food buying to sort of local entrepreneurs. So and there's the Cleveland Central Kitchen has like 100 food entrepreneurs, many of whom I didn't even know about. I mean, I don't know how many times for those who live in Cleveland, like you drive by there. I mean, I never knew what was going inside, but we did a project with them last year. So that's something to think about, I think, for those of us that are here. Like, how can we better connect our checkbooks to the degree anybody actually uses a checkbook anymore? Kind of like a Rolodex, at least our buying power with sort of local entrepreneurs, even if they're, not necessarily tech-based entrepreneurs.
Yeah, no, Eric's story is really fascinating. He was actually on the podcast a while back, and it is astonishing the number of brands that I think you come across in Cleveland that you don't really have a good sense that so many of them came from Central Kitchen. It's very cool. Awesome. Well, I'd love to kind of bookend it here with a traditional closing question that we ask for everyone who comes on the podcast, which is for your favorite hidden gems in Cleveland.
I probably come back to food. I mean, it's been really fun. I mean, even some of the pop-up kitchens, we just had a great meal the other day in the Cat's Diner with these two. I mean, they're entrepreneurs. I mean, this couple, I can't even remember the name of what they're calling their business. It's dumplings. They ran a craft brewery in Beijing for 15 years, and she's from China and he's from Cleveland. it's just so awesome. I mean, obviously you count in this category of sort of talent, whether it's through Venture for America, there have been people who have sort of ended up here. So I think making sure that we support restaurants, and, I think coming out of COVID, as we start to do more gathering in person, I mean, I think that's the other, I'm sitting in ThinkBox. I mean, I'd love to issue an invitation for anybody sort of listening who's not been to ThinkBox to sort of come. It's the largest open access makerspace in the country, and open access means it's open to anyone. And I think, okay, that's not obvious where you park, and there's some of these challenges. Well, and anybody that's lived, I always find it a little bit amazing being a Clevelander, having lived in other places where people are like complain about parking in Cleveland. I'm like, it's pretty easy to park here, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. But I'd love to encourage people, and you can look me up. I'm easy to find on our website, and just shoot me an email, and happy to show you around. I'm actually sitting right now on our 6th floor of ThinkBox, which is more hotel officing. I mean, anybody can come here and work out of here. I just think we need to gather more. I know, Jeffrey, you and I have run into each other a couple times at different events on campus and off campus, but like for the most part, many of us haven't seen each other in like 3 years. And so, would love for ThinkBox to be one of the places that people think of, and just like bringing your laptop and working out of here. We have great students in and out of the building, and we believe that we have lots of great talent. I mean, one of the great ways to keep people here, one is having them start a business in Cleveland. The other is like convincing a lot of other entrepreneurs and folks in Cleveland to hire these guys. So, love to have more folks on campus.
Yeah, no, I'll echo that. I think ThinkBox in particular is pretty underrated. It's such an incredible asset that we have here, and happy to spread the word. It's an amazing facility. Awesome. Well, Michael, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share more about yourself and the work that you're doing. If folks had things that they would like to follow up with you about, what would be the best way for them to do so?
Sure. Thanks, Jeffrey, for having me. I mean, the easiest is probably email, and it's michael.goldberg@case.edu. LinkedIn has become a very easy way to find each other. So yeah, I mean, any way that people want to connect with me would welcome the chance to meet and have you on campus and have you think box.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Michael.
Great. Thanks, Jeffrey. Really enjoyed it.
That's all for this week. Thank you for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show. So if you have any feedback, please send over an email to jeffrey@layoftheland.fm or find us on Twitter @podlayoftheland or @sternfa, JEFE. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please reach out as well and let us know. And if you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or on your preferred podcast player. Your support goes a long way to help us spread the word and continue to bring the Cleveland founders and builders we love having on the show. We'll be back here next week at the same time to map more of the land. The Lay of the Land podcast was developed in collaboration with the Up Company LLC. At the time of this recording, unless otherwise indicated, we do not own equity or other financial interests in the company which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of any entity which employs us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.